And we did invite David to be here, David Rubin, the filmmaker. He couldn't make it, but he really wanted to be here. So I asked him to just send me a few notes, because I won't be able to really give a background of how the film was made or why, but he said, so Michael Koskoff was his cousin. And when he told him about Tammy's story and her papa Renty, this is the filmmaker, felt sure that the lawsuit against Harvard would make for a compelling film. But as a filmmaker, he also knew that no matter how important the story, the key would be Tammy. And he would need to meet her. And when he did, it was absolutely clear that Tammy was a woman of enormous integrity, steadfast, determined, and he followed Tammy's journey for across 3 years, and she never wavered. White supremacy, institutional racism, reparations, none of these issues would have taken on any meaning in the film without Tammy's struggle and persistence. So that's what he said about Tammy. And then as we get into the conversation, I might throw in a few other tidbits in there, but let's start off. Just Tammy, tell us, why did you want this film made? Or talk about anything you feel is helpful to set up the film.
It's important also for context. Prior to the making of the film, for years, I had reached out to news outlets, media outlets, trying to get them to tell the story. And often Harvard would shut that down. They would actually say that I had no credibility, that I couldn't prove that I'm Renty's descendant, and they wouldn't tell the story. So for years I struggled to get the story told, and I just saw this film as a vehicle to reaching a larger audience.
And remind me to come back to that at some point with a recent Washington Post headline. So Preston, tell us about your involvement. I mean, we saw you up here, obviously, but as an attorney, and you have obviously a big background in civil rights and worked for this firm, left, and then came back, right? But what did this case mean when you first heard about it? It's a big deal to sue Harvard, I guess. I don't know. On an issue that has so many facets to it, and that many attorneys would have initially said, maybe, I don't know. But so tell us about your journey here.
First off, I would say Mike Koskoff, his intense interest in the case could not be overstated. And the firm has a history of taking on cases that no one else will take. It looked like they were not winnable, such as the San Diego film. Mike, early in the game, you saw he represented Black Panthers with his father. And people thought those cases were unwinnable. So his enthusiasm was intense, but what he believed was this case would have a chance to move the racial needle in America. And for me, also, I've had my time away. I spent time as a criminal defense attorney. One of the basic principles of criminal law is that the perpetrator of crime is not permitted to benefit from the crime that they committed, and that they don't gain good title in the property or other aspects that they gain through the commission of their crimes. It's very simple. So for me, also, after having such a long time in civil rights arena, criminal, it was like, yes, Mike and I, we just could not stay away. The other thing I point out with this case, which is really so profound, you understand that Tamara Lanier, her lineage is unsealed. And no, Harvard did not challenge that in the suit. They did not challenge her lineage. They based the challenge on property rights. What's so important about that is American slavery was very different from a lot of other slavery, and none of it was good. But American slavery at its foundation was to break up the families So you break up the families because they felt that's how you could have better control over their enslaved. Other societies, Catholic societies, believe kept the families together, that gave you more control. But, so you have this catch-22. You have where the families are broken up, and then when you try to engage in any sort of redress, they say, well, you can't prove your lineage. Well, what Mike and I immediately saw, what made this case so different, is we could prove the lineage beyond the genealogical threshold. And so that gives you a sense of why we got involved.
And then a little bit later, we're going to talk about what's happened since the film. But I want to, in the meantime, introduce David Harris. David is the former managing director of the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice at Harvard Law School. His extensive experience in many facets of civil rights issues, from police brutality and racial profiling to redistricting and domestic violence, as well as fair housing and community development. So David, how did you get involved or come to know about this case?
Well, listen, I want to start by saying, I don't know how to you know, I'm really pleased to be here. I've been with Tammy on other conversations, and you know, I think the most important thing for me to say, I've said it every time I've thought about this, is I see Papa Renty as my own ancestor. I don't, not only do I not see Papa Renty as just an image, I see my own ancestry there, and the case has always meant a lot to me. So, you know, I will say that at the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice, we think a lot about justice. And I would encourage all of you, every member of this audience, to think about what justice means to you. It's not a simple question. I've spent a lot of time, my career working on this, and for me, justice means quite simply to be made whole. Now, you've heard it a bunch of times in this film. It comes from the law, it comes from public health, it comes from religion. To be made whole. If that's your notion and your understanding of justice, it leads you to think about this case in a totally different way. It allows you to distinguish ownership from possession. Harvard possesses those daguerreotypes, but the ownership of those things is as different from possession as the law is from justice. And I think our ideals tell us that the law in this country leads us toward justice. That was intimated here. Throughout our history, law and justice have been quite separate and distinct, especially for black people. And I think the story and what Tammy has done and has allowed us all to do is to contemplate the meaning of justice and how we try to hold those who have continued to deny it our call to account. The final thing I'd like to say is that I speak this as someone who has a degree from Harvard, worked for Harvard, and I'm speaking of my own community, speaking as a member of the Harvard community. And I speak with great embarrassment and distress as that. And I will say, and then move on, I will simply say two things. Those of you who have ever visited that campus know there's a statue out in front of Harvard, a seated figure. The placard says it's John Harvard, founder of Harvard College in 1636. That's known as the statue of 3 lies. Not one of those things is true. The person who sat for that is not John Harvard. John Harvard did not found Harvard College. And that statue wasn't built in 1636. If you go on a tour, they will tell you that. They'll joke about it. It's a funny thing. It's folklore. And yet this is the institution whose name is Veritas. And I think that within those two things, we get a better understanding of how and why Harvard, on whose website it proudly boasts, is the oldest corporation in the Western Hemisphere, operates.
One of the things that David said is, he tried to get Harvard to participate in the film, and they refused. What are they so afraid of? Kim? They're afraid of you. You are so strong. They know they're wrong, clearly. Why are they so afraid of doing what could have been the right thing?
I think they view this case as the opening of Pandora's box. One thing that I did learn, and has later been written about in many of the major newspapers, is presently they are sitting on the cultural human remains of Native American and enslaved people. And they've known this for some time. And it turns out that a lot of these the Native Americans are Connecticut Indian tribes, Connecticut and Rhode Island, Pequot and Narragansetts, who I know and are friends with many people that are affiliated with those tribes. But when I talk about the opening of Pandora's box, it kind of raises what museums curate and the stories they tell, and the point that they leave out is much of this is plundered property and the vestiges of slavery or other inhumane acts. And so this case raises the question not only of repatriation, but also the cultural appropriation, the telling of stories. The one thing that was very apparent to me, Harvard had set the narrative for who these enslaved people were, and they weren't going to deviate from that, irregardless of what the facts were. And so this case, again, it raises those thorny issues of repatriation, cultural appropriation, sexual exploitation, and all of these things are things that Harvard would rather not talk about. And so they certainly want this case to go away, but the question remains, what else is it in your archives that you don't want people to see or know about?
They could have spoken to you.
Yes.
They could have treated you with respect. Preston, you want to talk about sort of, and I'm only moving things along because we don't have as much time as we would like. What has happened since the film was made?
Well, since that time, of course, you saw the case was appealed to the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. And as one of the attorney for the amicus briefs, I'll point out that the amicus briefs were just fabulous briefs, written by doctoral candidates at Harvard, archaeology grad students, anthropology grad students, archivists, and their attorney immediately shot a note to me and said, the court has eviscerated Harvard. And the bottom line is, what the court has stated is that will have our day in court. The case has been returned to the Superior Court, and there was some differentiation in terms of the opinions. One opinion which I strongly subscribe to, where what they did was they ducked or didn't deal with the issue on property. They claimed they hung their hats on supposed common law and property. But they didn't deal with the fact common law, as one of the justices pointed out, its main focus is justice and equity. And they dodged that. But what the court did do was say that we can go back, and they actually added for the negligent infliction of emotional distress. And they added something that wasn't in the complaint, the reckless infliction of emotional distress. So we will be going back to court, we will be trying this case, and we will be dealing with issues that Harvard does not want to touch.
And David, since that time, there was that big, I don't know how to describe it. They're like, oh, we're so sorry. We're going to create a fund and do something. I don't know what they're going to do with it. Can you sort of talk about that? And how weird is that they would do that at the same time they still barely acknowledge that Tamara exists?
One thing that Preston said is that recklessness, Chief Justice Butt was very direct about talking about the failure to respond. I mean, just on that level alone. But yes, Harvard did produce its Legacy of Slavery report, $5 million, a couple of years to do. That report talks about Louis Agassiz, talks about Harvard's legacy. That report has nearly 1,000 footnotes. It's covered over 50 pages. Throughout that report, there's not one reference to Tamara Lanier or to this case. This case was going on, and as it's doing its reckoning, there's not one word in there about this case. Now, lawyers might say, oh, well, we shouldn't talk about that. It's under litigation, but I think it probably deserved a footnote. On the other hand, what it did was made a whole bunch of promises about what Harvard's going to do, including $100 million, which got all the headlines. You have to understand, at making the film, I think it was $40 billion. I think the endowment is now over $50 billion. This endowment is larger than 110 of the 190 countries in the world. It's larger than the GDP of more than 100 countries. So I would say that on the scale of things, that amount of money is not much. But I think just as important, given their response to Tammy, I think they have no credibility about their willingness to reckon. And if I could read you something, I'm sorry. I thought at first I'd just read you what they said. They say, much remains to be done as we seek to live up to our highest ideals. But by undertaking these endeavors in good faith and with a commitment to meaningful action, the university imbues Veritas with new meaning and renews its commitment to excellence. Now, to me, Veritas is an absolute. How are you going to imbue it with more? Right? Right? I think they have a lot to live up to and a lot to grow into. I'd like to read you one other thing. President Backhouse said, we bear a moral responsibility to do what we can to address the persistent and corrosive effects of those historical practices on individuals, like Tamara Lanier, on Harvard, and on our society. So there's a way in which this report cops a plea that, there's an admission, in a way, of wrongdoing, and a promise to be responsible. But after the decision of the SJC, one of the things they could have done was say, well, now we've vindicated our property rights, now we're going to do the right thing. And as far as I know, there hasn't been any communication from them yet. Is that right?
That's right. And I would like to point out, that's all very nice lip service, which is what they've paid. The point that he mentioned, the $100 million, Tamara and I had the insight of Harvard grad, Harvard MBA, Harvard JD. They said, their endowment is over $50 billion. Their interest on that endowment is between 5 and 8 billion and upwards per year. That $100 million is 5 to 8 days worth of interest. But before it sounds too grandiose, we need to understand that.
0.009%. And that's likely over 10 years. That's an endowment. That's not all going out. That's over
right.
10 years.
And also in terms of the report, Harvard all along has gone into this kicking and screaming. You would take, okay, now, so this is 170 years. What has taken 170 years to begin to talk or put a report out about its complicity with slavery? One of the things, and I will tout, and I will confess, if you will, or disclaimer, I'm a Brown University graduate. And Ruth Simmons, in 2003, she commissioned the study of slavery and justice. And in that study, when she did that, none of the peer institutions, including Harvard, they all remained silent, either when she announced it or when the report was written. And in fact, some of the Ivy League schools had the nerve to claim they had no connection with slavery, which shows you is the most ridiculous. The entire economy was based on slavery. You know, so to make that statement is ludicrous. But Ruth went ahead and they issued the report. The report was just stunning and revealing. There's been a second edition which came out. And one thing, you know, they released all sorts of information which, after Harvard remained silent, there was a professor, Craig Stephen Wilder, and he decided to out all the original schools, Ebony and Ivy. And that book, in it, he shows the exact involvement of all the original founders of Harvard, as well as how they mortgaged enslaved people, in terms of how their involvement was with the slave traders in South Carolina, Barbados. That's who they curried. And in fact, that's why Agassiz was in South Carolina, because here slavery had been outlawed in Massachusetts a long time. The transatlantic slave trade had been outlawed since 1808, but here you had Papa Renty was brought illegally here after that point, but that went on. And you can see that in Traces of the Trade, a story from the Deep North by Katrina Brown. But the fact that Harvard at every step of the way is obfuscated, has declined responsibility, and they've been pushed and screaming into taking this position of responsibility. So in as much, I'm not gonna take away from the fact that they've issued this glowing report, but the question is, yet what tangibly are they really doing to address this incredible atrocity? And here we have a very tangible instance where they can do something about it, and they can't take the most basic step to move forward without being pushed.
We're going to open it up in just a minute, but I want to also say, so I was doing some research for this just today. See a Washington Post headline from June 23rd of this year, where it calls you the purported descendant. What the heck? So why do you think, I mean, so it's not just Harvard, obviously, that's the problem here. What are people, it's who you are. They know that you're telling the truth. Why are they all so afraid of the truth?
I had an amazing conversation with Marion Moore, Louis Agassiz's great-great-great-granddaughter, about just this. And what I've come to realize is that no matter how far you think you've come, how much you've advanced, how much you've accomplished, for me, a black woman in America, I still have to fight for credibility. And I share this conversation with Marion because we talked about when they say that they're the granddaughter of Louis Agassiz, it's accepted, it's not questioned. But when I say that I'm the great-great-great-granddaughter of Renty, I have to prove it. And so, no matter how much I accomplish, how much I prove, I still lack credibility in America. And that's sad, but it's a reality. And and I've come to terms with that. And one of the things that, the legal part of the case, I had many conversations with Mike Koskoff, who talked about the richness of oral history and the importance of it. And we lose sight of the fact that for people of color, for descendants of American chattel slavery, our experiences aren't recorded. They're not documented as such. My mother didn't have a birth certificate until the 80s. But the point I'm trying to make is what we had to rely on was oral history. That was and is who we are. And much of what was written about us was inaccurate. And so oftentimes we'll hear people devaluing the value of oral history. And I push back on that to say that is, for the most part, all we ever had. And how important it was for us. And for me, how accurate. When I did the tracing back from the stories that my mom shared, it was as if she was reading from documents that I know she never saw. That's how accurate our oral history was. And if it wasn't for that accuracy, I could not have traced back and definitively linked myself to Renty. And I have done that. It has been certified. And there is so much more information about the ties to my family and the family that enslaved Renty. But it's a sad reality that, like I said, no matter how far you've come and how much there's still an issue of credibility for Black women.
Well, we're going to open it up, but I also want to say, you know, the power of film to tell stories can't be understated. And this film will be, I think it's going to be distributed. It's still, so David made this. Nobody commissioned him to make it. He made it. He believed in the story. He wanted to tell the story. And he knows the importance of the story. I think he'll probably go back maybe and add some more at the end, which would be a good thing to do. But there's also another film that if you haven't seen called Descendants about the history of the Clotilda. I mean, it just sort of, it's a continuum and the stories go together. But that's why, you know, at the film festival, we're so glad that we're able to bring stories that you might not get a chance to see otherwise. So we'll open it up for questions. Yes?
I'm just wondering who you mean when you say Harvard, because all of these decisions sound very corporate and, you know, that they're being made on the basis of what's going to make money or not make money. And I'm wondering about the academic faculty. So the president, where does she stand? And then all of the other faculty down the line.
So the question was, who do we mean when we say Harvard?
My interactions have been with Harvard President Drew Faust. I have also written to academics at the university. But Harvard, as a corporation, I guess has one voice, and that is, or one message, and that is to say nothing, to deny, deflect, and to discredit me. And so when I talk about Harvard as that one voice, I talk about the corporation. I could speak for hours about what the students have done. They actually voted to condemn Harvard. The student undergraduate population voted, that class voted to condemn Harvard for their treatment of Renty and my family. The academics have been quiet. I have reached out to them, and some have said they're not at liberty to speak publicly, either to me or about this case. I have heard from students who have said that they have been kind of intimidated because of their participation in this case and for the support of this case. When I have visited, the 2 times that I've visited the campus, I think you saw one on the film, or both of them, but I was greeted with security and police. So when I speak globally about Harvard, the corporation, I speak about that one message that they are clear on, to deny, deflect, and discredit me. And when I speak about the students, I always speak warmly because I have shared with them are the lifeblood of that corporation, and their opinion should matter, and their concerns about how they have engaged with these daguerreotypes should matter to the corporation. So yeah, I guess that, you know, depending on the context of the conversation, but I do try to qualify, you know, the students have been amazing. And
David,
they still are.
Did you want to jump in here?
Well, I wanted to say that the official, and I don't know what corporation is, the President and Fellows of Harvard College Corporation, officially. It's overseen by a very unfortunately named group called the Board of Overseers. You know, it also used to call its deans of houses masters until a couple of years ago. But I do think that when I'm speaking of the corporation. You know, and I think that I want to echo, though, what Tammy said. The students have been incredible. The faculty are, I'm not, fortunately, I was not a faculty member, so I don't have those constraints, and I was able to speak out before I retired. But we are speaking about a corporation here. So, I mean, in the same way we speak about GE.
Another question, someone? Yes.
Hi there. Thank you so much for telling your story. It was really enlightening. Gave us a lot to think about in the parks. I'm just curious, from a filmmaking perspective, are you continuing to film now through the next juncture? Is that something that's happening? I don't know if you can talk about it, but are you continuing to tell your story?
David has a website where he has updated like the Mass Supreme Court decision. And, you know, I have said to him, there has to be a sequel because there's so much going on. And just the historicness of what's to come. meeting, the attorneys talk about, because when I got the decision, I was actually disappointed. I was, when we were in the room together, they were bouncing off the walls, and I was like fighting back tears, because the one thing that was important to me was possession and control of the daguerreotypes. As it stands now, it's still left in Harvard's hands. But the court has said you can go back. And the court, if you look at the language, there were 3 concurring opinions, and they were all very damning. They condemned Harvard in every way possible. And the court talks about different levels of extreme, outrageous, reckless infliction of emotional distress, not only to me and my family, but for what they did to Renty and Delia. And they made a path for us to go back and to file for these types of inflictions of damage or harm, which was historic. But then when you think about, now we are going to have a trial to not only determine what that looks like, what that kind of harm and infliction of emotional distress looks like for Renty, for Delia, and for me and my family. And so that is amazing in itself, and it will be the first time historically that enslaved people and the lineal descendants will get to fight for the emotional harm caused by slavery. And I sit back and I marvel over what that means. How do you quantify that? How do you measure that? And just what we will be doing in the future. So there is a lot more, so much more, and the importance of what we're doing moving forward than what we have in the past. So I'm excited about the future. And I've said, David, you have to have a sequel, because what we have to do, I think, really, what we've done really pales in comparison to what we have to do.
One aspect of the decision, the court's decision, was that they made it clear in terms of statute of limitations did not apply, that the harm is still being perpetrated, and that the clock is still running. So, for instance, after we brought suit, Harvard came up with that book that you saw, that they sold, and that they sell for $40-some odd. They all, as you heard, they license, charge a licensing fee, utilize the likeness. And so, that is all going to be part of the suit as we moving on. And David, being the incredible filmmaker he is, I'm sure he will not miss a beat as we move forward.
Given where we are with the U.S. Supreme Court, right? This case gets there?
Oh yeah, well.
Okay, we won't talk about that.
We're in the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court.
Yeah.
And we're going back to the Superior Court, and maybe if Harvard chooses to carry this matter on that long, who knows? By the time we get to the U.S. Supreme Court, it may have a different configuration.
Yes, sir. So thank you so much on this project. As a piece of art, it's tremendous. But for myself and maybe many others, I'm quite familiar. I did not know I was looking at your descendant Renty, but those images were used in Ken Burns' Civil War documentary. Ken Burns is a hero of mine. And so when I first saw it, that's quite familiar to me. And he utilizes those in the first episode over Frederick Douglass's famous speech in Thinking of America. Thinking of America, I sometimes think of, and then he talks about how it's all tainted with the sin of slavery. And so that piece of art kind of lives on, and now this is such a tremendous additional piece of art. But what power concedes nothing without fighting. And that's what you have really displayed for this generation. Ken Burns' documentary being in the 80s. So, you think an institution like Harvard is such a T-ball, something so easy, and something that they could do that would only would help, and the refusal. So it just you display for, again, this new generation that it's not about the veritas. When most people think of Harvard, it's the elite academic standing. It's about power. And that's so helpful just for people to recognize, as you talk about, the difference between the law and justice. When we have these institutions of power, of influence, of it's more so, it's about the power, and it's just very helpful, informative. Best of luck as you go forward with the justice that, I'm hopeful that you will secure.
Right there.
I was just going to say that the damage that will continue to be perpetrated is occurring in the medical arena because
Can you speak up? I can't hear you. I'm sorry. I can't hear you.
That the atrocity in your family is part of this oral history that's being shared, and there's been many other examples of people's abuse and being subjects of medical research without their consent, without voluntary consent. And the damage that is perpetuated is that in medicine, we don't really understand the impact of certain diseases on Black women. For example, I'm a breast cancer doctor, because this legacy of abuse has prevented people, has eroded the trust, and kept people even today from participating in clinical research. And the only way to move forward is to make reparations, to earn the trust, to have transparency, respect people's autonomy and free will, and engage people in a way that respects them. But the damage that this story is part of the oral history, it joins other stories to have a lasting effect, and really a double effect on our ability to move forward and provide that care and respect and for people like yourself.
That's so important because there's a book, Medical Apartheid, and actually the author wanted to use the image of Renty on the cover. She told me she had to fight Harvard because they tried to prevent her from using the image, and she said, I would not give up, and I insisted that she wanted that picture. But we kind of gloss over a bit the impact of Louis Agassiz's race science about Black being an inferior species, not having the same blood as us, not feeling pain the same as white, and what that did early on to poison the minds not only of scientists and other doctors, but people in general. Abolitionists, slaveholders, they all embraced this theory, and it was all during a time when this country was so terribly divided over the question of slavery. Here you have the most premier academic institution in the world coming out with this justification for scientific racism. And then all that involved and all that went on to not only compromise people of color in this country, but all over the world.
Sorry, back there, and then I'll get to you over there.
Just very briefly, I just wanted to make a comment about another piece in the movie that was so powerful and so touching for me. I saw this almost as a tale of two families. And I've been involved in a lot of community dialogue about reparations, this big scary R word, and everybody keeps saying, oh, well, those of us bathed in white privilege are never going to get, what does that mean? This film showed a very concrete example of how a step might be taken in that direction. And I have to know this by a couple really brave and committed women. So.
Well, Traces of the Trade, which if you haven't seen, you should also see. I mean, there's the same issue of family comes into play, but in that family there was a lot of infighting about who would own up to their family's history, and they just didn't want to talk about it. This is Rhode Island.
It is an important aspect. If you haven't seen that, that's an excellent documentary, Traces of the Trade, a story from the Deep North. And what Katrina Brown, when she began researching her family, she said, wow, it's hidden in plain sight, just like in America. In general, what happened to the enslaved was hidden in plain sight. So she said, she began looking under the covers, and what she realized, there were three rules of her family. Three aspects that you did not discuss. You did not discuss politics, you did not discuss sex, and you did not discuss the Negroes. And what's profound about that is her family, they were the #1 slave trading family in America. And they were in Rhode Island, out of Bristol, Rhode Island. Rhode Island was the slave trading capital of America. And you know, Americans in general don't know this. This is where the information gets distilled into the ether, and people come up with these ideas that were influenced by Louis Agassiz and all these other folks to justify slavery, and it's impacted the general thought process. But then she said one other thing that we need to know. She said that her family knew what they were doing, they knew it was wrong, and they did it anyway. And all I will say in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement, when you watch that, well, you see how it's evolved. I mean, my being in criminal law and civil rights, you know, we've been yelling till the cows come home in terms of police shooting unarmed black persons. And in all my years practicing criminal law, I never had one white person unarmed who was shot in Connecticut by a police officer. And much less not one who was shot where their cell phone was mistaken for a gun. My point being was people of goodwill, their framework, they thought we were engaging in hyperbole, exaggeration, till they saw George Floyd. And then people of goodwill said, whoa, this is not the narrative we've been taught. That's not supposed to happen in America. And when you begin to the need to peel back the layers, there's so much misinformation. There's another book Susan Nyman wrote, Learning from the Germans, Race and the Memory of Evil. And also Brian Steve, they talk about the fact that the South, the Confederates lost the Civil War, but they won the battle of the narratives. And part of that is because the North also, as I said, with the Wolf family, was just as much involved in slavery and racism as the South. So when they finally finished with the Civil War, they said, we're done with this. We don't have to really deal with these issues anymore. But it allowed for evil to play. It's had an incredibly damaging aspect on our lives. So yes, there's a lot to learn. We need to keep learning. We need to peel back those layers, because most of what has been put out there for us has been just pure obfuscation and wrong information.
Can I give a little historical note here? I'm gonna kind of underscore something. I'm gonna take us way back to 1619. All of us are really tired of hearing about it, I'm sure, but you all know that sometime in late August 1619, some number of Africans landed on the shores of the British colonies, right? That's the way it's reported, because we don't know exactly which day. But on July 31st, 1619, was the first meeting of representative democracy in this country, right? That's celebrated, recorded as historical fact. We don't know when black folk came here, but we know they had that election. But we also know that that election excluded not only black folks who weren't here yet, women, Native people, and non-property owners. In other words, our representative democracy is anchored in exclusivity, in exclusion. That has been the pattern that we have followed for the whole history of this country. And what Harvard is doing to Tammy is the same thing. It's exactly the same thing. It is denying her narrative and her place in history. And the damage and the violence that they are doing to her is the equivalent of the damage and the violence they did to her great-great-great-grandfather. And I know you're out of time here, so I'm going to cite, in this Harvard report, they cite the people, the members of the community who fought against them, kind of the resistance fighters. And they named Charles Hamilton Houston, who was the person for whom the institute I directed was named. Charles Hamilton Houston once famously said, "A lawyer is either a social engineer or a parasite on society." Funny, huh? But it applies not only to lawyers, it applies to each and every one of us, and in fact, it applies to corporations. And it's time for Harvard to decide whether it's going to do some social engineering or continue as a parasite on society.
And with that note, I want to thank everyone. We could stay here all night. I could anyhow. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for Tamara, Preston, and David for being here, which was such an interesting conversation. Thank you all. Continue the conversation down the street. Thank you.
Thank you.